Good morning, welcome to Conservatorium Maastricht, where we are holding our second day of Jazz Master research presentations. Today we'll be starting our presentation of Aleksandrs Mariničevs, and we will start with a presentation video, after which we'll return here to the live room for the Q&A. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to my research presentation that's titled Structured Approach to Introducing Open Strings to Jazz Improvisation. Let me start by explaining why I chose this topic. At some point last year, I realized that I'm not particularly happy with my initial choice of topic. And to give myself motivation, I decided to pick something that would be as relevant and as practical as possible. At that moment, I just happened to be busy with the idea of introducing open strings into my playing in a more conscious level. Specifically, my problem wasn't the following. Even though I liked the sound and extended harmonic and melodic possibilities that the open strings provided, and I have already used them in my own music, I felt like the way I'm using them is very intuitive. You could almost say random. I felt like I'm just grabbing whatever option is possible, and that doesn't sound too terrible. I felt like I'm lacking a deeper understanding and control over this concept to be able to use it successfully. In general, I feel like there's a problem with using open strings in jazz. They're kind of hard to use. To all the non-string players in the room, let me explain. So, the open string is exactly what it sounds like. You pluck a string with your right hand without using your left hand at all. You get a tone that this particular string is tuned to. It's rich, bright, resonates really well, and has probably the longest sustain that the instrument has to offer. It's awesome. Now, why would those be hard to play? They're not. In fact, on itself, it's probably one of the easiest things to play on a stringed instrument. You only need one hand to do it after all. One of the first things beginners learn on guitar are so-called campfire chords. Those utilize open strings heavily. However, in a context of jazz guitar, open strings are traditionally almost never used. Why is that? There are several reasons for that I can think of. Stringed instruments have a certain geometry about them that has both advantages and disadvantages. Because of the way the guitar is built, you can often play the same note in many places on the fretboard. Let my very good friend, Jonathan Kreisberg, demonstrate it for you. In other words, more positions equals more options, but more positions also equals more harder. It can already be a challenge for many guitar players to gain sufficient knowledge of the fretboard that would allow them to confidently improvise in the traditional to jazz vertical way. But at least we have the comfort of horizontal transposition. Once we introduce open strings, however, this little comfort is gone, and and each voicing, each scale position now gets completely unique. In less scientific words, a lot of stuff gets really hard. Another reason that comes to mind is also connected to the nature of guitar. It lends itself very well to certain keys. Guitar players know how much fun it is to play in keys like C, D, A, or G. There's a reason why almost every Metallica song is in a key of E minor. The guitar resonates beautifully with open chords in the first positions of the fretboard. There are many open strings that are ringing, and being able to use the low E, A, or D as a drone sound offers beautiful sonic options. At the same time, jazz music has been historically dominated by flat keys. Wind instruments such as saxophone and trumpet that have been on the foreground of jazz ensembles are commonly tuned to keys like B flat or E flat because of more mellow sound and easier fingerings. Many famous jazz standards that are commonly played were originally Broadway songs, and they were written in a key that would fit the singer. But as bebop culture was growing, those tunes were used as vehicles for improvisation, so they were transposed to a more comfortable, most of the time flat key, and eventually recorded this way. Back in the 1940s, guitar was only starting to become a soloing instrument, so I can only assume there were just not enough guitar players to prevent this flat key domination. As a result, most of these tunes are still being played in the same keys today, and if you're attending a jam session, you are expected to know them in those keys. You could get away with this as a singer, but as a guitar player, you are very likely to get a side eye once you request Autumn Leaves in E minor. Guitar at a time was a bit of a weird child in jazz family, and was forced to adapt to play in the keys that was comfortable for everybody else. I myself tend to be quite organized in my practice. To be able to practice a concept successfully, I really like having somewhat of a clear approach plan. Where would I start? What are my options? And what are my end goals? With a concept so broad, there wasn't really an established method or a good book that I could find. So I decided I'll just make my own. Essentially, I wanted to create a roadmap for myself, an organized and coherent way to practice those new concepts and gradually introduce them into my playing. Hi, Sasha the editor here. As I'm sitting here and doing the final touches for the presentation and getting ready to send it, I realized there's one important thing that I didn't yet mention in my presentation, so I'm gonna correct it right now. When I say that there wasn't a method that I could find, I am by no means saying there isn't any information or instructional videos on this topic. You can find quite a lot of nice videos on YouTube with creative concepts and good explanations. What I mean is that most of those are rather situational and only explain certain voicing or a specific concept. In contrast, there are many method books and practice routines that focus on scales, arpeggios, pentatonics, drop voicings, bebop phrasing, and so on. And compared to those, open strings are still rather unexplored. This research is essentially an attempt from me to tap into this category and try to develop a method that would be useful, at least for me personally. There are also a number of guitar players in the past and present that have applied these concepts in their playing. In my research, I didn't go into depth in analyzing their approach, but of course hearing those ideas from other people is what essentially got me interested into developing this topic. I won't be able to mention all of those guitar players, but some important names include Bill Frisell, Pat Metheny, and Rolf Tauner. a very, very practical, action-based research. And the biggest part of it is just me documenting my practice, reflecting on it, and making decisions on the go. Over the course of this research, I've created many exercises, as well as several jazz standard arrangements. I've compiled all of that information on my YouTube channel, as well as notated it in scores. In the end, I also ended up composing 2 original compositions that heavily utilize open strings in them. That wasn't something that was in my original goals, but it just happened naturally as I was busy and having fun with this concept. This is how my research questions or goals looked. How can I integrate open strings in jazz improvisation in an organized way? How can I organize many of the voicing possibilities that open strings offer? How will the extensive usage of open strings influence my choice of keys to play in? And which possibilities and limitations does the usage of open strings present for different keys? Now, I will quickly guide you through my research process. My original plan was as follows. I would spend the first half of the researching and categorizing different voicings, and the second part dealing with scales and other single note concepts. I decided to approach it one string at a time and go through all the keys and voicings before moving to the next one. Mostly because I was already foreseeing that the amount of material will be very big. I decided to start right away in the context of 2-5-1 and 7 chords. The idea was that once I see how that works in context, I can always go back later and start over in an even more basic way. Here are the rules that I gave for myself for the first group of exercises. I can only use drop 2 voicings on the inner string set. I am only using the basic structure 7 chords when possible. I am using a high open E string on all the voicings. I cannot have the note E anywhere else in the voicing except for an open string. If a note E occurs 2 times, I'll have to change the note that's fretted. With those rules, I started my research. At the end of the first group of exercises, I've come up with 27 examples. Each of those in foreign versions, so that's 108 unique chord progressions in total. For each key I used several variations of a 2-5-1 progression, an altered one and a non-altered one. I tried to use different tensions on the dominant chord as well as different ways to substitute an E note if it was already in the chord. My plan from there was to do the same process for the lower string group. Afterwards, go through all the other available open strings. In this case, it would have been only the open B, since all the other strings are already in use, and I wanted to avoid using pedal tones, so a low E or A for now. Afterwards, I would change a voicing to drop 3 and repeat the process again. Then do the closed position voicing. Finally, I would repeat the whole above process with a minor 2-5 variation, and that would have been the conclusion of the first cycle. Quite a lot. So far, the things were quite systematic, but I still felt like I'm lacking a clear justification on why I do certain things and not the other. The bigger picture still wasn't clear, and outside of my strict rule set, there were just too many possibilities yet to explore. I wasn't getting a much clearer grasp on the concept either. I did, however, singled out for myself some very nice voicings that I wasn't familiar with before. That being said, I did have a feeling that I need to change something in my approach. It was at this point when I was discussing my progress with my teachers, and I've been offered a different approach to the whole thing. Instead of focusing on a single string and building the process around that, I was suggested to focus on a single key and explore the harmonic options that provides. This way, I would have a stronger connection to the actual musical implications of my research. I proceeded to start a new research cycle from there. This time, I decided to take it one chord at a time and start from triads, not 7 chords. The rest of the original rules would stay the same. The following process looked like this. I started in the key of F major and explored all the options with an open E string. A close position, drop 2, drop 3, in all inversions and all string sets. I also added a little melodic arpeggio variation with a hammer-on pull-off technique. As I was already suspecting at this point, I might not have enough time in the end to separately dedicate it to melodic applications. After that, I harmonized the scale and applied these variations to all the chords as well. I also dedicated some attention to the F Lydian scale and explored some options there as well. It was too tempting not to look into it, as the somewhat modern sound that it provides stylistically fits very well with the wide sustained sound of open strings. To finalize my exploration of the key of F major, I picked a tune in that key and tried to use the voicings and ideas I got while working on it. Here's a little fragment from it. Along the way, I also got the inspiration to arrange one of my favorite pieces of music for solo guitar. Originally a solo piano piece, it has wide intervals, a lot of polyphony, and lots of pedal. Approaching it a bit like a classical tune, I was able to utilize open strings extensively to overcome those challenges and hopefully come closer to the intended sound of a piece. As I kept working on my research, I have repeated this process in the keys of B flat and E flat. In the beginning, I was only dealing with the diatonic options, but later I've come to realize that I should instead adapt the chord functions to the one fitting with the open string. This way, I was using a natural B in the key of B flat, making it flat 9, and so on. I have also made an arrangement of Stella by Starlight and My Funny Valentine. And then it was time to submit the research. I had to put a stop to further exploration, analyze what I've got, and draw some conclusions. As you can probably see by now, this research is unfinished. From the very beginning, I had a suspicion that I wouldn't be able to cover every possible voicing, but once I started digging into the material, I realized just how much of understatement that was. There were so many moments when I felt like I could just keep going, exploring new possibilities in a single voicing or key. But in order to make real progress, I had to move on. It was important to keep a broad overview of the process, rather than get stuck too long in one place. I had to cut down on my original plan and only focus on the harmonic part, but I believe that has allowed me to put all my efforts there and hopefully internalize it on a deeper level. Looking back at both approaches I tried, it was definitely a good idea to switch the perspective to a more key-centered rather than string-centered. The decision helped me to see more clearly how open strings interact with functional harmony in context. By spending more time inside a single key, I could spot the way familiar voicings transform when an open string is added, and I found those changes easier to understand and remember. Looking back, there were undoubtedly a lot of things I could have done differently. For example, I could have pushed the dominant 7 material much further. In the first half of my project, I didn't go into as many extensions and as many alterations as I could have. I also didn't explore minor 2/5 options or the common jazz reharmonizations of a 2/5/1 progression. Many of those would have ended up combining ideas I had already covered, which might have made it hard to keep everything organized, but going down that path would have made the research even more complete. In fact, if I had followed the same approach I used later in the project, which is starting from the triads, I could have built up the first part in a much more systematic way. For example, I could have gone through each triad in every key using only an open E string, then expanded into harmonic and melodic minor scales, diminished and augmented scales, and eventually into 7 chords and progressions, all still based on just one string. It would have taken an awful lot of time, but it would also made it for an awfully thorough exploration. Do I believe that this is a process that every guitar player needs to go through? To be honest, I absolutely don't. As I mentioned both in the introduction and the conclusion of my written work, this way of approaching is extremely time-consuming with a given material, and realistically, no one will be able to memorize or use everything it produces. What it does offer, however, is a rather clear roadmap. In the end, this research was about me and my practice and my understanding of things, and in that regards, it was very useful. Going forward, I will most likely approach it by running through as many possibilities as I can and just picking the ones that really resonate with me, then analyzing those deeper and adding them into my personal vocabulary. Even though I didn't manage to document everything I explored, I feel like this research was successful. I was able to experiment with different ideas, create a few logical systems for myself, and most importantly, spend a lot of time playing. That hands-on approach, testing, recording, analyzing, gave me a much stronger understanding of how to use open strings in creative and functional ways. And I can already see it feeding back into my music. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, one of the direct results of this project is that I ended up writing a couple of original compositions based on the ideas I found here. Both of them will be part of my final exam performance, so while the outcome of this research isn't necessarily wildly surprising, I found it genuinely useful and inspiring for my artistic growth. Now, let's try to answer my main research question. How would my ideal practice process look based on the things I've discovered during this research? Let me try and put it on paper. Tackling one key at a time, I would explore all the typical triad voicings, such as close, drop 2, drop 3, on all 3 string groups, and their relationship to the E, B, G, and D string. At first, I would only add one open string to the chord, without substituting any existing notes and avoiding doubling notes where the range and context allows. I left out the low A and E string to keep the exploration of pedal tones as a separate topic. After covering all the one-chord triads of the scale, I would then harmonize the scale and move on to a different key. This way, I would cover all 12 keys. The next step in the process would be to repeat everything in the relative minor keys. Since some of the relative minor voicings would have already shown up while harmonizing the major scale, there would naturally be some overlap, but this would also open up more room for variations. After going through all the tried voicings, I'd likely repeat the same process with 7 chords. That would take quite a bit longer, since each voicing has one more inversion to deal with, and there are more chord types involved. At that point, I would probably stop adding tones, as there are fewer ways to make 5-part voicings work on guitar compared to 4-part one. While some unique chords could still be found, they'd be much more situational and harder to integrate. Overall, I realized that with this amount of potential material and variations, the challenge becomes about knowing what's worth pursuing and when it's time to move forward. The next step would be to start combining more than one open string. First 2, then 3. Using all 4 open strings feels a bit redundant, as that would pretty much just end up sounding like E, B, G, and D with a different bass. Still, combining 2 or 3 could potentially add a lot of new color and interesting voicings to the palette. After covering most of the 4-part voicings with the open strings, I would then come back to the triads. But this time, I would try substituting one of the tones instead of adding one. I didn't start with this method because even though these voicings technically have fewer notes and might seem simpler, they're actually more mentally challenging. Since the full triad structure is no longer present, the harmonic function of the chord can often become ambiguous. These shapes basically turn into rootless voicings that could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on which note you hear as the root. This makes them much harder to internalize than just adding a tone to an already stable voicing. The next logical step after that would be to apply the same substitution concept to the four-note voicings, and eventually try using multiple open strings in those altered structures. As for the 3rd and 4th research questions, I still can't give a full answer. I didn't manage to cover every key in the second part of the project, but from the ones that I did explore, I noticed that the keys on the bottom left side of the circle of fifths, like E flat or D flat, tend to produce more altered dissonant sounds when open strings are introduced. For example, an open E becomes a flat 9 in a key of E flat, and in the key of D flat you'll get a lot of tensions, like sharp 9, flat 13, and so on. In contrast, keys on the upper right side of the circle, like G, D, and A, tend to line up more cleanly with the open strings, often producing scale tones instead of tensions. You could make a conclusion that a guitar indeed lends itself slightly better to the sharp keys, at least if we want to avoid alterations. It takes 2 whole steps to the right in the circle of fifths to encounter a first clash. In the key of A major, an open G is a flat 7, therefore doesn't fit into the Ionian scale, whereas all the way across the circle to the left in the key of E flat, an open E, B, and A are all altered tones. Also, in E major, you can still make use of an open E, 2 of them actually, and open B, whereas its neighbor on the left, the key of D flat, doesn't have a single open string available. Regarding my last question, I'll admit I don't yet have enough data or maybe enough perspective to fully answer it. Apart from noticing some interesting overlaps, like enharmonic chords, I didn't spot any large-scale patterns that felt worth highlighting. That's
Start, good. So welcome back in the live room in Maastricht, where we will continue with the Q&A. Thank you, Sasha, for your presentation video. I would like to first turn to Greg for a first question, since you're the supervisor. Could you start it off.
All right, so thanks all. First of all, it was nice working all this time, with you. It was cool. And I would have a question. Maybe you could say a couple of words about your original compositions. There were like more arrangements, or there were also like
no, they were. So they were really composed with open strings in mind, kind of as part of the composition. Just sort of utilizing the nature of the guitar that I talk a little bit.
Right. So maybe you could say like describe how this research translated into like some concrete artistic ideas or pieces. So if you could speak about your compositions, maybe.
Yeah. So it wasn't as much the research kind of finalizing on that, rather than as I was writing the research, I was just playing a lot, and then some of the ideas some of the exercises that I was coming up with, they sounded like, I was like, oh, that could be a tune. If I maybe continue this and then add a few chords, then it becomes a tune. So one of the tune I use has basically an ostinato. Those are not really sophisticated ideas. Also, it's mostly ostinatos. So the first tune has an open D and open G for like 90% of the tune, and then like a bass note and like some harmony notes change in the middle. But there's a ostinato going throughout a whole tune, and it's kind of a big part of what creates the sound of this piece. And then the other one has note G also going through the whole tune with the keys changing multiple times, and then this one ostinato note basically functions as a different degree of a scale every time, and that kind of, I feel like because of that I'm able to go really far harmonically, since there's always one united tone, and it always sounds connected no matter kind of where I go harmonically.
It was a fresh approach. I mean, before you didn't have this kind of approach. It was like something. What changed your approach in compositional?
Yeah, to be honest, I cannot say yet fully that it's really fresh. In a sense, like those are not really novel things, and I think I did something similar before, maybe in my playing as well. It's sort of playing to the advantages of the instrument when I can have a certain shape, move it around, and just see more geometrically. Okay, if I move this one note, does it sound cooler or less cooler? And then if I follow the cooler, then we have even more cooler, and then good.
Cool. Nice. Thank you.
All right. Maybe you have a question?
Yes. First of all, congratulations for your master's thesis. I was thinking if you can elaborate a little bit on your literature review, because you were talking about Ted Green.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit interested on his work.
So I didn't use literature very extensively in this research because it was really mainly in the practical sense, but the Ted Green book is something that I worked with before, and like a lot of the voicings that I then use in this research, like I take the voicings some of them that I learned from there, and then I add different strings to it. So it was not as much used in the research, rather than it was leading up to the research. Like I was able to work on the research because I had this knowledge prior. So it's a bit more like that. And I think the same applies to other things I mentioned in my literature. They weren't really actively used this year in this research, but it's rather like I worked with that before extensively, so I felt like it has a place to be mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, well, one question from my side would be, how do you feel regarding structures of voicings, right? I think you described quite a lot that you are looking for let's say the existing structures, but replacing the commonly gripped notes by the open strings, right? But then, isn't it also a very interesting opening to actually look at what very different type of structures than the traditional ones would be surfacing through the open strings? Did you reach that point, or is that more in the future, deeper thought search process?
It is more in the future. So yeah, as I mentioned, I wasn't able to like establish any kinds of patterns, or like being able to say, oh, okay, these things I noticed and that, and then I can see it somewhere else. So I hope that is something, is if I keep researching, I would be able to do something like that. But yeah, I didn't really discover any new structures.
Yeah. Okay.
But that was indeed like a big part of what I was trying and still trying to find, and I believe it is somewhere there to be found.
Yeah. And in terms of internalization and use in let's say free spaces like a jam, let's say, where you have a random piece that you didn't prepare and you put it out, you know the chords but you didn't prepare this. Are you already at a point of internalization that you are using that, or is it early and something you want to do
a little
more?
bit, not fully, but at least in the keys where I managed to work a bit more, I have like some vocabulary that is there, and I would need to be able to actually use it fluently. I would need to myself to go through those keys again and check those exercises again. Some of them actually did sound really nice, and I kind of marked them to come back to them and maybe study that once I have more free time. But already at this point, in those few keys that I went through, I would like to believe them. I'm a little bit more proficient than I was.
Yeah. I mean, they seem very useful keys for for this context.
Indeed. So like already like in B flat, I kind of can expect the certain options I can use with the E or with the B. And knowing which, okay, like I'm on the one chord, I can use the open B now, I will get a flat 9.
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily the kind of stuff that you can also do it intellectually, right? Before actually playing that, you can kind of predict those things, but I do think that makes a difference, actually, playing it on the instrument, hearing the sound of it, and
Yeah, it seems like probably the smartest angle you took to take those keys that are not so open string logical.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that in the end after doing this research, that it was a good pick to take this segment of
I just felt like that in the first part I was going kind of clockwise through the circle of fifths, so starting with the least jazz keys actually. So that's why like on the second half I just decided to do the opposite and just go through the flats first, and I just didn't reach the full circle yet.
Yeah.
So that was kind of
yeah. Any questions here in the room?
Did you also try to detune your open string just to fit into the keys that doesn't really work? For instance, D flat or something else?
Yes, this is something that I also do. I didn't do it in this research because big part of the research is actually me talking about that it's a really big concept that you always kind of can add new layers, and then you add one layer and then it becomes now 50 times more stuff. So I feel like with the same way that I didn't really want to deal with pedals, that I kind of felt like it's a bit of a different concept sound wise. With retuning the strings, I think it's something that introduces now a whole new area, and it's something that I would either do afterwards or just treat as a separate thing, because my focus was really on like a standard tuning and how that works in certain tonal harmony. But of course this is something that I am doing, I did before, and will keep doing probably.
Any more questions? Any here? Very good. Okay. Yeah, Tom?
What kind of styles did you explore with that method in mind? Or were you mainly just locked into jazz and see how it fits with standards and stuff?
I was focused more on the traditional tonal harmony, so that's where I went through styles. It wasn't really much to do rhythmically. I was like stylistically trying to use the more traditional jazz language with like 2/5s and stuff like this, or picking standards, right? The few arrangements that I did are also rather in the traditional tonal harmony, because I felt like that's where the most challenge was it's much easier when I'm dealing with my own music and I have like a free choice of basically keys, and I can stay modal for as long as I want, and I don't really have any connection to the key. But when I'm forced into this, like, okay, now I'm doing Days of Wine and Roses, it's a F, it's very F major key, and I need to see what I can do without going too far in that, and kind of staying in the context of this tonal F major harmony.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
And so thank you, Sasha, for your presentation and for your defense here in front of us. Thank you. We will now go into recess, and at 1 o'clock we will return here first with the presentation video of Tizaan Alphonso.